This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and I'm doing an episode of Nitsa Notes today. Normally that comes out on Saturday as my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. But there's a special release on Magic Arena this week that comes out today on Magic Arena. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit in a video, so we're doing an extra bonus episode of Nitsa Notes this week. And that special release is, of course, Khans of Tarkir. This is not a remaster or anything like that. It doesn't include cards from all over the Tarkir block, which is kind of what I thought it was going to be, but that's not how it's turned out. It's just literally them putting Khans of Tarkir on Magic Arena. All 269 cards from that set are going to be on Arena, and there's going to be limited associated with it. And that's great, because I think Triple Khans of Tarkir is one of the best limited formats of all time. I am a little bit biased. I stopped playing Magic between about 2008 and 2014 or so. While Khans of Tarkir wasn't the first set when I came back, it was the first real set. Like, I came back fully with M15, which was the core set just before Khans of Tarkir. But it was the first, like, real set, and core sets back in the day of M15 were not good limited formats. So I was really happy about that because I'd always liked limited Magic, and then this set came out and it was a ton of fun. This YouTube channel was started right around the time of Tarkir. Not Khans of Tarkir, but some of the earliest draft videos on this channel are from Dragons of Tarkir, which is another set in the block. So, you know, I love this set. I think it's great for limited, and I'm really excited to be able to play it some. We'll see how much content I make of it in terms of draft videos, maybe more episodes of Nitsa Notes. It'll depend kind of on how this video does and how people respond. Generally speaking, when something is a special release digitally, it doesn't do nearly as well if it doesn't also exist in paper, is how it's worked out so far. But either way, I wanted to do this video, and the main thing I want to do is what I usually do when we have a new format coming, and that is an overview of the mechanics, which will also help you understand the archetypes in the set. Because there are 5 main factions in this set. Each of them is a wedge. In other words, 3 colors. There are shards too, but these are wedges as opposed to shards. And so each of those has a mechanic, as is usually the case in a faction set. And then there's one overarching mechanic that shows up throughout the set. I want to start first with this overarching mechanic, which is Morph. I think this is a really good limited mechanic. So if a card has Morph, and usually they're creatures, this means you can play it face down for 3 generic mana as a 2/2 creature. Then it has a Morph cost associated with it, and you can pay that cost at any time to transform. Well, it doesn't transform. That has a different meaning in Magic, doesn't it? It turns face up. That's what happens. And there are a lot of different designs with this. This set has tons of cards with Morph. And one of the great things about it for limited is that it makes it so that, you know, if your curve is looking a little bit high, but like your 6s and 7s have Morph, it's not as high as it looks. And so you're able to play more top-end cards in a world where the fail case is that this is a Grey Ogre, right? So you have cards with really simple Morph designs like Glacial Stalker, which is a 6 mana 4/5. Wasn't very good back then. It's still not that good now. Not quite as bad overall then as it is now. That's one thing to keep in mind. This set came out back in 2014. And in terms of creatures especially, the power level is not as high as what we're used to. But either way, a 6 mana 4/5 isn't great. And that, you know, would not be a card you ever play. But it has Morph, which means you can play it face down as a 3 mana 2/2, like I said. And in this case, the Morph cost is 4 generic and a blue. The total cost you pay is, of course, not going to feel like you're getting a great deal either. You end up paying 8 mana for this 4/5. But there are a number of things going on that make it better than that sounds. One of those is that you pay it in installments. But another is that this can cause so many problems in terms of like what your opponent does. If you have mana up and they try to kill your 2/2 and you make it too big to die to their removal, if they block with something that would be able to kill the 2/2 but can't kill the 4/5, you can transform it. Like, you end up, I keep saying transform, but you know what I mean, turn face up. So there are a lot of benefits to Morph. You can just have it as threat of activation. Your opponent's afraid to block. And there are so many Morph creatures in the set that you can't really zero in and be like, okay, this is Glacial Stalker. Like, you can't do that. So it gives us a really interesting element in limited of really unknown information that makes combat interesting, makes trying to use removal interesting. And one important thing to note is that Morph does not use the stack. So, for example, your opponent can't say, I'm turning this face up, and you can respond by shocking Glacial Stalker. It's too late. Glacial Stalker will be a 4/5. This gets particularly interesting when we're talking about cards that have abilities when they turn face up. Most of the morphs that are uncommon rarity or higher do have those. They give you something else when you turn them face up. One example of this is something like Horde Ambusher, which is normally a 2-mana 2/2. But you can play it face down as a morph creature if you want to, and when it's turned face up, it makes it so a creature can't block. This also, by the way, there's an uncommon cycle of morphers that are all free to transform, so that's one thing to keep in mind. You don't always know what's going on, even if they don't have mana untapped, and Horde Ambusher is one of the ones that's free to turn face up because you just reveal a red card. So, yeah, Morph is sort of it's a mechanic that's in all 5 of the main factions within the set. There are a few morph payoffs here and there, but there aren't really morph decks so much as just you should expect to see a lot of morph in the format. And you're going to have to think a lot about what that face-down creature might be, what it might be able to transform into. I think that makes for really interesting games. And also, it's an interesting decision point. When do you transform your creature, turn face up your creature, and so forth. So that's sort of the broad mechanic that you can find in every one of the main factions in the set. Let's dive in now with a talk about each of the 5 faction mechanics and also a bit of discussion about what the archetype is. So let's start with Abzan. This is black, green, and white. And 3-color decks are a very real thing in this format. There's an uncommon cycle of tri-lands. There's plenty of fixing. So, you end up playing 3 colors more often than not. It's not like Streets of New Capenna where it was like, you're usually 2 colors. Maybe you're splashing a third. You still usually have 2 predominant colors, but it's usually more of a splash on your third color. Anyway, Abzan, black, green, and white. And their mechanic is Outlast. A card with Outlast, like Abzan Falconer, has a mana cost. Outlast is an activated ability. You pay that cost, in this case 1 white, tap that creature, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it. All the Outlasts put the counter on the creature. They do all have different costs for Outlast. This is really one of the cheapest ones around. You can only Outlast as a sorcery. So basically, these cards with Outlast are, it's interesting because if you have a creature around that isn't big enough to attack, well, you can take a turn to Outlast it, and maybe it'll be big enough next turn. And it gives you sort of a mana sink. If you're in an Abzan deck and there's a board stall, you usually got something to spend your mana on because your cards have Outlast. And the big mechanic, the big archetype for Abzan is +1/+1 counters. It's mostly about outlasting, but there are other ways to get counters on your creatures. Abzan Falconer here is part of a cycle. I think there's 2 uncommons and 1 common, all of which grant a keyword ability to your things that have a counter. In this case, you get flying. There's also one for lifelink. There's one for first strike. And those are all pretty good because oftentimes they can come down, and even before they've outlasted themselves, which obviously will give themselves that keyword, right? Before they even do that, they can often come down and immediately give your other stuff flying because you've got other counters lying around. So Outlast is a nice, fairly powerful mechanic. It does depend on how expensive the Outlast is, how good the base creature is. Not every card with Outlast is just good, but a lot of them are, and especially the ones that are both Outlasters and +1/+1 counter payoffs are going to carry a lot of weight in your Abzan decks in this format. Next, let's take a look at the Jess Sky mechanic. Jess Sky is red, white, and blue, and it's Prowess. This is one you know very well. This is when it made its debut. This is the first time we ever saw Prowess. Now it's a deciduous keyword, I believe, which means we could see it in every set, but it's not usually going to show up a ton. Every now and then we'll have a set that does feature it heavily, like original Khans of Tarkir did. So this is a spell deck. Prowess is whenever you play a non-creature spell, your Prowess thing gets +1/+1. So we're talking, entirely about a spell deck. There are a ton of instant speed ways to interact in this format. There's a bunch of cards that look like they wouldn't be very good, like Defiant Strike, that in a world where you have Prowess is incredibly good because it triggers all your Prowess stuff, replaces itself, gives you a buff. Jess Sky decks are often turning their Prowess creatures sideways, leaving a bunch of mana up, and putting the opponent in a painful spot where they're just not sure how big their creatures are going to get. Obviously, prowess works best when we're talking about using instants to do stuff, because the ability to buff your creatures at instant speed is way better than, just doing it in your main phase when you cast an enchantment or a sorcery. But obviously those things are nice too, but the thing, sort of the defining element that you'll really find with the prowess decks is my opponent has mana up. They've got like 8 instants in their deck and all their creatures have prowess. So you're put in a spot that's pretty rough. A bunch of the cards with prowess also happen to have an additional non-creature spell payoff associated with them, especially at uncommon. We've got this. There's one that grants flying when you cast the spell until end of turn. There's one that grants lifelink, and these are the especially powerful ones. Just sort of like with the Abzan thing, you not only have a card that is doing the mechanical thing you want to do, but it also pays you off extra for doing it. And those are the cards that are really, really strong. Let's look now at the Salai mechanic. Salai is blue, green, and black, and it is Delve. This is another mechanic you might be fairly familiar with, especially compared to Outlast, mostly because a bunch of cards in Constructed were utterly broken with this mechanic. Most famously Treasure Cruise, right? Treasure Cruise not as good in Limited because it's not necessarily easy to load your graveyard. You certainly don't do it quickly. Still pretty good in Limited, though. The Salai deck's a graveyard deck, as Delve would tell you. It's good at loading its graveyard. It's got a bunch of cards that are like, look at the top 3, put one in your hand, put the other 2 in the graveyard. These kinds of cards are great in the deck because they make your Delve cards like Murderous Cut into like 1 mana removal spells. And there's just tons and tons of ways to load up your graveyard. Obviously, that means this deck is fairly controlling, fairly interested in making the game go long. Unlike, both Abzan and Jess Sky can be pretty aggressive. Salai, not so much. So really, of all of the decks, this is the one that's the best at doing control stuff, which isn't surprising given the 3 colors of blue, black, and green associated with it. So yeah, make the game go long, load your graveyard, cast stuff with Delve, and of course there's other graveyard payoffs lying around. It's not all just about this mechanic. The mechanic certainly informs what the deck is about, but in this case, it's not all that the deck is about. You've got other graveyard stuff going on too. Next, we've got the Maru mechanic. That Maru is red, white, and black. And this mechanic is Raid. Another one you might be somewhat familiar with. It was in one of the Ixalan sets as like the pirate mechanic. And basically what Raid means is if you've attacked this turn, something extra happens. An example of this is Bellowing Saddle Brute. In this case, it's actually that something extra doesn't happen because it's a 4 mana 4/5. And if you haven't raided, you lose 4 life, which is a pretty big downside. But raiding's not that hard. This color pair or combination has a ton of tokens that are expendable. So even if you don't have a great attack to just, send something in at your opponent with the plan of actually like making them trade or take some damage, you can sometimes just send a token in. And like I said, there are plenty of those, generally goblin tokens. The Mardu have a bunch of those. And when you do that, you're frequently able to trigger raid for a very low cost. And this is another deck, obviously it's aggressive, it wants you to attack, it wants you to be playing things like Mardu Horde Chief, which comes into play with a 1/1 token when you've raided and things like that. So you're turning your creature sideways a lot here, and you're especially interested in generating extra value out of cards with raid, and really it's a go wide deck too. That's the other big theme for Mardu in this particular set. And then our last mechanic is the Temur mechanic. Temur is blue, green, and red, and their mechanic is Ferocious, which means if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, something happens. And, again, this is a relatively aggressive deck. It's less so, it's more of like a mid-range sort of monsters kind of deck where you want to have high power cards that grant you extra stuff. But it can also just curve out with things like Heir of the Wilds, a 2 mana 2/2 that gets a buff if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. And there are a bunch of cheap cards in the set with power 4 or greater. There's also, this combines interestingly with prowess sometimes. Like Bloodfire Expert, for example, is a 3/1. But if you trigger prowess, it has 4 power, and suddenly it turns on all your ferocious stuff. So sometimes you can line things up that way. After all, you're in 2 of the colors that are also in the prowess, wedge. So, there are some overlapping things like that. But yeah, you generally want to have creatures with high power that are, good at attacking. and give you extra bonuses with your cards that care about 4 power with the Ferocious mechanic. So that is sort of a quick overview of the set, the mechanics, how they work, how they play. You know, this sometimes when I do these mechanic videos, I'm talking about mechanics I've never played with before. In this case, I've played with all of these and a bunch. And again, excited about this format being on Arena starting this week. And there'll certainly be some content going up on the channel. How well it performs will inform whether or not I do more of it than just a little bit of stuff this week. But if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, including some Cons of Tarkir content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.